Someone was in my house. They sat on my couch. They stood over my bed. They watched me sleep. And they were laughing. The worst part? I didn't know until I watched the footage.
Welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, you found this place for a reason. I cover the stories that don't leave you. The ones that crawl under your skin and stay there. Tonight's story is one of those. Lock your doors, turn the lights on, and whatever you do, if you hear laughter in the dark, don't assume it's harmless.
The houses on my street were spaced like teeth, neat, identical, each crown separated by a dark seam of yard that swallowed porch light and sound. At night, those seams were more than empty grass. They were pockets of absence where anything could hide, and nothing had to announce itself. I liked walking them at 2 in the morning. The world simplified then, one foot in front of the other, Finn's small body close at my side, the hush wrapping around us like an extra layer of clothing. I always came back calmer, convinced that solitude was better company than most of the daytime noise. Finn was with me the night that started the slow, patient unraveling. He was a dachshund mix, 10 pounds of nervous heartbeat and soft fur, the kind of dog that preferred skulking behind a coffee table to charging down a hallway. He never barked much. He listened. That night on the walk, the neighborhood felt ordinary and empty in that agreeable way. The streetlight near the cul-de-sac hummed, and the world smelled like wet asphalt and wood smoke. We were 3 blocks out when something breathed a laugh into the dark. It was a sound that didn't belong to the neighborhood, a small, private thing, like someone letting air through a grin. The laugh was too shaped to be a stray noise. It had the cadence of a human throat. I stopped and leaned in, as if proximity could force clarity. Finn's ears pricked, and he inched closer to me. The laugh moved, soft and amused, from the seam between 2 houses. There was no porch light, no outline of a body, just a private sound stitched into the cold. Probably a kid, I told myself. People left lights on for late-night homework or a parent calling in the dog. The rational voice is cheap comfort when you hear laughter in a place that should be hollow. Finn tugged, impatient, and I kept walking. We turned the corner and the seam swallowed our silhouettes. When we came back 20 minutes later, the grass between those houses was the same black slit. No small body, no skateboard, no radio light. Nothing. That should have ended it. Another late-night mystery filed under small and explainable. Instead, the laugh folded into me like a secret I could not spit out. I convinced myself the sound had been playful, a noise with no ownership. The rational voice kept trying. I let it. At home, I did the things people do to anchor themselves. Lights on in the kitchen so everything looked lived in, Finn's bowl filled, the lock turned because the sound and motion of locking made the apartment mean something safe. Finn burrowed beneath the comforter like he always did. The night swallowed me, and the apartment folded into its usual rhythm of small noises, the tick of the heater, the distant hum of a truck, Finn's soft breath. Sometime between the small hours, sleep loosened, and I thinned into a place where the body falls, but the mind sometimes drifts. When I woke, Finn was not on the bed. His warmth was absent. My hand fumbled under the covers and touched cotton only. I blinked, groggy, and felt the room like a bruise. Finn sat by the bedroom door, a small silhouette, ears forward. He did not look at me like a dog waiting for breakfast. He looked like a guard, tense and small. When I called his name, his gaze flicked toward me, then fixed on the hallway. He rose, padded to the edge of the bed, and sat again, body tensed toward the door. Something light and Finn rolled across the room. Laughter, unmistakably the same sound that had lived in the seam between houses. This laugh was muffled at first, like someone behind a curtain, then not muffled at all. It came from the living room, from the couch we never used after midnight. The hair on my arms lifted. I slipped out of bed and told Finn to stay. The peephole showed the porch in its sleepy halo. The porch was empty. The sidewalk was empty. When the laugh came again, sharper and closer, it landed not on the porch but inside the house, a living room laugh, practiced and patient, as if someone had been waiting in my furniture to watch me move through my life. The couch sat in a pool of dark. At the edge of that pool, a slight leaning shape resolved into a woman's outline. Slight shoulders, small tilt of the head. The smile she wore was wide and unmoored, a toothful sphinx that didn't warm. She looked at me and let out the softest private giggle that should have been a tiny sound in a crowded room,
but in my living room it had the weight of an accusation. I ran up the stairs and wedged myself in the closet because the closet seemed small and close and honest. I called the police with my throat on fire. I stayed in the dark among my shirts and pressed against the hangers like some animal that hoped being still would make it invisible. When they found her on the sidewalk later, the woman stared like a sleepwalker in a cheap nightgown, hair plastered to her face with the kind of dust that shows hands had dragged across windows. She did not belong to our subdivision. The neighbors had seen that much. She was a foreign punctuation in the sentence of our block. Her family later said they hadn't heard from her in 2 weeks. The officer said she had a violent record. The back window had been smashed in a clumsy, panicked way. She had come in. She had sat on my couch and watched, and she had laughed as if at a private screen. For weeks I could not shake the image of that smile. It made the edges of every ordinary thing snap like brittle glass. The laugh followed me inside the sound of the refrigerator cycling. I slept poorly and moved 3 times in the year after, scraping rooms and leases for a place that smelled like that night. I told myself moving would tidy the memory like clearing broken glass.
It did not. The second thing that got my bones folding into anxiety was more clinical. Doors opening at night when they should be closed. At first it was a fluke, the kind of thing you suppose you might have forgotten. But it happened again, and then again. The bedroom door would be ajar in the morning. I remembered closing and locking it before I slept. The lock's satisfying click had become a ritual. Waking to the door open became a drumbeat in my blood. I bought a cheap camera, the kind that plugs in and records to an SD card, because cameras feel like allies. They are not. They are witnesses, and witnesses will sometimes tell you that the world is more competent at making your life a stage than you prefer. The footage made my stomach fold. I ran the footage back and saved the timestamp. At 1:44 a.m., the door's latch made a soft click and eased inward like a secret being parted. For a long 30 seconds, the doorway was a black well. Then a figure stepped into the room, a man this time, tall and long-limbed, wrapped in dark clothing. He moved like somebody who had practiced moving without making noise. He came to the edge of the bed and stood over me for 40 seconds. The camera caught the way he tilted his head, like a student examining a diagram. He stared for those 40 seconds as if he were cataloging sleep. I rewound the footage a dozen times, watching his measured steps, his gloved hands, the slight rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. He left the way he had come, the door easing closed. I woke up 20 seconds later, heart battering against the ribs in a rhythm my teeth could count. I tore open the door and screamed for help in the only way that felt human. I called 911. The police came and went in the way police sometimes do in suburban scenes. Professional, thorough on paper, thin in presence. They dusted and swabbed. The forensics team ran print plates and wrote succinct clinical notes. The evidence was maddeningly absent. He had left no prints, no stray hair, no unclosed cigarette. The only thing that remained was the camera footage and the knowledge it showed me. Someone had been inches from my face and left without waking me. He had known, the evidence suggested, when not to wake me. They told me to change my locks and to stay with friends. They recommended counseling in the way institutions recommend bandages for gaping wounds. I followed their advice like a ritual. I stayed in hotels. I sweated in bathhouses' uncertainty until the dates on my calendar blurred together. Everything that followed felt like an echo in a hallway whose end I could not see. When I returned to the apartment weeks later under the thin, watchful light of a noon that felt foreign, neighbors greeted me with tight smiles and the kind of spare condoleezzations that mean they were relieved it had not happened to them. I kept Finn close. He slept over my feet like a living talisman, requiring me to know his shape in the dark. Some part of me wanted to believe that the incident was a singularly bad incident, a one-night glitch in the universe's otherwise benign code. But the universe does not fix itself. On impulse, a week after the man-creature's 2-minute trespass, I put the camera back and set it to record every night. If someone wanted to watch me sleep, they should have to sweat under film and pixels. I set the sensitivity high enough to take every twitch as evidence, and the camera paid out a spool of small torments. There were nights when the footage showed nothing but the dim, steady wash of blue from the streetlight hitting the curtains. One night there was a sound of footsteps on the roof, like sloppy, casual steps, and I scrubbed the feed slow and found an imprint of shadow crossing above my building like a small storm. Another night the motion sensor caught something leaning into the frame of my kitchen window and staring in for a full 60 seconds without moving its head. The eyes in the window caught nothing behind them for me to see, but the shape of that figure and the way it favored my lonesome apartment with attention made me feel like some organism under study. What skyrocketed things into a new sphere of madness, though, was when the laughter returned. This time not just outside, not just in the living room,
but threaded through several small, impossible places. The sound idea itself was not loud. It was small and amused, like someone walking past the edge of a joke and smiling in the dark. But it multiplied. I would hear a thin, private laugh inside the drain while washing a glass, in the hum when my furnace kicked on, in the soft breathing of Finn asleep under a blanket. I would be in the grocery store and think I heard a faint laugh between the cereal aisles, and the sound would be as if someone leaned into my ear from a world with no daylight. Neighbors started to watch me as a subject. Not all neighbors. Older people came by more often with casseroles and that quiet, practical concern that comes with proximity. The young ones pretended nothing had happened, though their eyes slid when I walked the lanes. Sometimes, on the stairs, I ran into a man with a jaw that tightened when he thought I wasn't watching. He was the kind of person who kept his hands in his pockets and his head low. He lived 2 doors down and worked nights, the kind who said the shortest words. He would smile in a way that did not reach his eyes when he passed, and I caught him talking on his phone once with a voice lower than room light. This neighbor, Mr. Everett, I learned his name from a form, began to creep into the hum of my days. He looked harmless, but harmlessness is a costume people polite society wear. The wrong costume makes you assume things about the person beneath. Everett started knocking on my door with small talk, claiming he'd seen the police cars and that he hoped I was all right. He'd bring spare blankets sometimes, or a cup of coffee in a travel mug, as though these domestic items would function like a bridge across the small ache left by what had happened. He asked me how Finn liked the new leash, how my work was going. He always lingered at the edge of conversation, his voice measured. He did not ask about details. He asked about patterns. "Do you walk the same route at night?" he asked once when we stood by the mailbox. When I told him I varied the route now, he nodded as if happy with that. There is a particular kind of person who gives you the advice to vary your routine. They know, in a way you do not, how creatures watch us and learn. Variance is the obvious defense. It is also a way of telling you, I have noticed you. I told myself not to look into that thought. I told myself Mr. Everett was kind in the common, bare-handed way. But the laughters multiplied, and so did the signs that someone was testing.
Once, in the middle of the night, Finn whined and rose from the couch and padded to the window. He sat and watched the seam between my building and the next. The inseam of light between porches was exactly where I had heard the first laugh. Finn kept his nose to the cold window and pressed there like someone listening for a far-off concert. I watched him, a hard insect. When a car drove by, its heads turned and the light washed across the next building's yard. There was nothing there but paper-thin shrub silhouettes. Finn's body remained rigid as a wood stump. "Okay," I whispered to him into the dark, an absurd gesture of confidence. "Okay." He didn't respond. He just leaned into the glass, the same way his kind leans into the world that will not give them secrets for free. The nights kept accumulating. The camera gave me more evidence, but evidence is a poor salve for the nervous self. The more I watched, the more it seemed like the world had been watching before me. There are small shifts you do not notice. Someone turns off a porch light you always leave on, or a leaf falls at the same place every other week, or an unfamiliar car idles 2 houses down at the same hour when you walk. The human brain reads patterns into such things, and then waits. Once my brain learned a pattern of being watched, it found more patterns everywhere. Then came the time I woke with my jaw soaked in the metallic film of fear. The camera had recorded a man opening the bedroom door the way the previous intruder had, softly, clinically. He moved across the room and stopped, not at the bed this time, but by the hallway. He turned his head as if listening to something in the house, and then he went to the living room and sat down. The couch accepted him like it had been made for his posterior. For a long 5 minutes he sat. He began to laugh, small and private. Every hair on my body, except my scalp, seemed to stand up. His laughter was familiar and wrong. He did not call out, did not move to the stairs. He merely laughed like a man reading the punchline of a joke that required no audience. For the first time, the camera caught his face, just enough angle to see his jawline when the lamp in the kitchen threw a wash of amber into the room. He had no visible expression other than the tilt of satisfaction. He was someone who enjoyed the way the room smelled at night. I called the number again. The officers returned with new boots and a newer patience. They spoke in gloved clinical phrases about stalking and violation and pattern of entry. But there was the problem. None of the doors had been left open. The locks showed no new marks. It was as if the man had a practiced silence as part of his craft.
Forensics seemed to look for fingerprints. It was the human way to look for what leaves a mark. Some people leave nothing. You may think that logic arranges the plan that follows. I thought that logic too. Buy new locks, keep the shades drawn, always sleep with the radio on. I did all of it. I installed deadbolts, then an alarm. I left a light on all night. I got a hotel for a week, then a month. But the rituals also teach your enemy where you are and how you will behave, because rituals root you to habit. The nights became a long series of little terror testing. The laughter started to be accompanied by notes, a faint tapping on the external wall at 3:12 a.m., a ring of the deadbolt's metal when there was no one at the door, a smell of cheap perfume in places where it had no place. Once I woke to find a single child's shoe on my porch step at dawn, too small to be mine, and too clean to look like it had been outside for long. When I stepped out into the morning, there was no sign of a child, no explanation, only the shoe waiting like an offering. I began to notice the way people arranged themselves around me. Neighbors who used to wave at me now kept to the other side of the path. A woman from across the hall stopped answering my texts. Mr. Everett continued to be useful in the way people are useful. He moved things when I was gone. He watered my potted plants if I told him to, and he always took longer than was necessary to answer, his words deliberate, measured. He kept a timing that made me uncomfortable. Time, in his presence, felt like it was being recorded. When you live under surveillance, either of your own making or imposed upon you, the world becomes a landscape of potential front doors. You start to map the architecture of chances, where someone could crouch, what kind of footfall a person in boots makes versus a person in socks, how a shadow might appear on a curtain when there is no one outside. The intrusions escalated, but never in the obedience of a typical horror movie. There was no rush into brutality, no violent crescendo that proves an antagonist's commitment. Instead, there was a ladder of quiet, a cigarette butt in my ashtray when I lived with no smokers, wet footprints on the welcome mat at 4 a.m., the remote moved 1 inch to the left on the coffee table. Small, domestic things shifted as if a presence disliked disorder. He or they liked my life arranged a particular way. Maybe he enjoyed watching me return order to disorder as much as the disorder itself. People who study living thems learn patience. One night, my stomach a tight stone and my sleep a flutter of broken pages, the camera caught what would become the worst frame. It showed the outline of a figure at the foot of the bed just before dawn. The figure moved with slowness that suggested a confidence. He leaned forward and with a careful hand smoothed the blanket across my legs. Then he whispered, but on the audio the whisper was untranscribable, something soft and private. The next cut showed me waking with the impression of a mouth at my ear that had not been there 3 breaths earlier. The enforced intimacy of that footage unhinged something in me that words can't patch. He had not hurt me physically. The footprint he left was something worse. The impression that my sleeping body had been observed and curated like a specimen to be studied. To wake with the sensation of someone tucking you is to be made tiny.
I left. I left like a scolded animal, carrying Finn and the small documents of my life in cardboard boxes. I moved across the country with a determination that seemed like an overreaction even to myself. I told myself time and geography would solve the problem. When you keep moving, you tell yourself movement is an immune response. But terror is a disease with a long incubation. 2 years after crossing several state lines and starting again in a place with different air and different sunlight, I got the call from home. The woman, they had released her because she had been found not competent. The man's prints never matched anything in a database. Mr. Everett had turned out to own an assortment of locks and keys and an unnerving knowledge of local routes. He moved away quietly 3 months after I left. The police said they had no new leads. They use language that tries to reframe trauma into neutral terms. No evidence of a pattern, unrelated incidents, unable to prosecute. These phrases are tarp covers for things that leak. The last night I slept in the house I still remember vividly, like a soundstage I can walk into any time the mood comes upon me. It was the night before the final move. The house felt small that night, like a skull. Finn had aged, his muzzle showed the gray of another life. We sat in the living room, the old couch propping us both up in the dim. The silence was a kind of peace. Then a laugh drifted from the seam between houses, the first laugh I had heard years ago. It was small, patient,
as if someone had kept the same joke and checked it every so often. I walked to the window and saw nothing, only the rift of night between lawns and the hive of neighbors' lights dim. As I stood with Finn at my side, the laugh came from the living room behind me. It was the quiet, private sort. I turned and saw the couch empty. The air in the apartment grew colder, the kind of cold that answers to bodies even when no bodies are present. Finn stared at the center of the room as if waiting for the little thing we had feared. There are few comforts left to people who have been watched enough. You learn to trust small things, a sleeping dog, a neighbor who will hold a spare key, the fact that morning changes the world because sunlight dispels shadows. But you also carry a residue, like a fine dust no broom removes, of expectation. Expectation that the laughter will return. The last thing I learned was that laughter's geometry is wide. It covers alleys and porches and rest stops. It fits inside cars and under highway overpasses. It can be practiced by strangers with no reason someone else can see. The world is full of small amusements and small predators who watch people sleep because they need something to measure time by. That is why, even years later, a laugh in the dark will empty my chest. That is why I still check the hallway every time there is a sound. Why Finn sleeps, when he can, on the threshold between bed and door. The house was abandoned and resold and painted and given fresh curtains. People forget rooms if they do not own the memory of the night. My memory remains like a small creature that will not be shooed out. It rides with me when I sleep, a quiet and precise ghost that tells the time by another's breathing. So if you like to walk at night, please keep moving, keep brisk, keep the dog close, or find a friend whose presence does not pretend to be anything other than a person with two good ears. If you wake to a door that is open and you did not open it, do not assume anything kind about coincidence. If you choose to ignore the little nitrations life gives you, those coughs and footfalls and the way a laugh bends into a shadow, do so with the knowledge that some listeners will not leave you after they have watched once. They are patient, they are fond of the patterns we make, and there is a kind of suffering that comes from the realization that the boundary between you and the night is porous, that the seam is not gone when you think it is only waiting for a better joke. I write this now from a place with heavy curtains and a dog who snores like an old man. Finn's muzzle is wider, and he sleeps in the chair nearest the hallway, his eyes half open so he sees more than he should. Sometimes late at night I think I hear a small laugh beyond the rooms and the distant stretch of town, and my first instinct is to check the closet and the camera in the window. I learned the lesson in the simplest cruel way possible, that people enter rooms in the small hours without waking you, that they measure you like a specimen you will never know was on display, and that the worst harm is the one that shows you how unguarded you already were. If you inherit my memory, take it like an instruction. Light the lamp, keep the dog close, and be suspicious of private laughter. It is the sound that belongs to those who watch, to those who favor silence as a hobby, and to those who will night one night think your movements are interesting enough to learn.
And that's the thing about this story that never leaves me. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was people. Real, breathing, patient people who decided that someone else's life was theirs to watch. That is the most terrifying truth of all. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here and you like stories that make you double-check your locks at night, subscribe, because I have more, and they only get darker. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the scariest things don't announce themselves. They just laugh.